Hi everyone, hello. Just letting everyone connect and join. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Sorry, apologies, my computer's beeping away as we go here, so apologies for that. That's just as people register. Okay, so just before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping things. You'll notice your microphones are muted. That's just to keep some form of order, I suppose, as we go, just so everyone can focus on what we're talking about. But there will be opportunity definitely to engage and share your views as we go. This event as well is recorded. That's so that colleagues who can't join us today will be able to make use of all the info and insights that are shared throughout this session. So just bear that in mind as we go. We do want this to be two-way, so please do post any questions that you may have in the chat as we go. So you should see a little chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll collate those questions and then ask them to Jen at the end. So with that out of the way, welcome to the first public engagement seminar. My name's Ollie Moore. I'm the Outreach Programmes Manager at Oxford Physics. And this is the first of a series where we hope to share best practice in public engagement with research and also touch on access and outreach initiatives as well. And it's hosted by Oxford Physics, but welcome to all. And I can see that we've got a nice cross-section of people from across the university and even beyond as well. So welcome to you all. We want this to be open and informal and discursive. We're keen to hear your views and perspectives, so please do share your ideas and ask questions. As I mentioned, we'll have an open discussion at the end, so definitely don't just come here as a passive audience member. Join in, chip in, ask, challenge, it's all welcome. And also, finally, please do let us know what you'd like to see in a future seminar. Like I say, it's part of a series. We'll include a survey link at the end, so let us know what you think and what you would like to know more about for future sessions. Okay, so with that all out of the way, before I hand over to Jen, what I would like to do really is get the measure of the room. So I've kind of been embracing new levels of Zoom technology, and I've done a poll, so I'll kick that off. And it's just to get a feel for where you're coming from and what level of experience you've got with science capital as a concept. So I'm going to start that now. Hopefully you can all see that. Give me a wave if you can see that. Oh yeah, we're getting responses in already. That's brilliant. Lovely. Okay, so we've got a strong physics presence, plenty of other STEMers. Okay. Okay, I think we've got a good measure of that. That's brilliant. Okay, I'll just stop the elevator music. Okay, I'll share the results there. So hopefully you can all see that. So Jen, yeah, you can see we've got majority physics, but it's a pretty even split, which is good because science capital applies across STEM. Okay, so a few people have never heard of it, which is good. This is a complete intro. We will start from the beginning and share it as a concept right from first principles. The majority know a bit about it, and there's a few pros out there as well. So Jen, hopefully you can cater for all levels of experience in this.
I will do my best.
Okay, excellent. So I'll just close that down. Hopefully that's disappeared from your screens now, but give me a wave if not. So Jen, I'm going to hand over to you now. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Jen DeWitt, you are a research and evaluation consultant, and you specialise in learning engagement with science, particularly in informal settings, so that's outside of school. She's a senior research fellow at the University College Institute of Education, and critically for this, part of the research team developing and applying the concept of science capital. So without further ado, hand over to you, Jen. Thank you so much for your time and expertise in joining us today. Hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. It's popped up that somebody else is in the waiting room, so I'll just leave that up to you. So thank you to everyone for having me here today. I am going to now attempt to share my screen. So let's see, I did this for the first time about 10 minutes ago. So let's see, desktop. Okay, let's, oh wait, okay, here we go. Let's see, I think that is working. I can see a few people got thumbs. Great, great. Okay, cool. So basically, again, thanks so much to Ollie, who I've known for many years in a variety of contexts, for inviting me to speak today. And obviously today I'm talking about Science Capital and physics. And in particular, the insight that the work we've been doing on Science Capital, the insight that it might provide into engagement and physics, in particular, participation in physics and extending to things like, you know, outreach and that sort of thing. And so into those who pursue it kind of after it's compulsory in school, perhaps all the way up to being professional in it, with people who might engage with it more broadly, who come to outreach events that you might be doing and so forth. So just to start with a bit of background. Okay, that was supposed to advance. Let's see what happens. Okay, there we go. The concept of Science Capital emerged out of a pretty substantial research base. There are kind of a couple of interlocking projects involved. The first one is the Aspires project, which sometimes gets conflated with Enterprising Science, but they are two different projects. And Aspires is a longitudinal study of young people's science and career aspirations. And Aspires 2 were looking at 10 to 18, and we're starting in on Aspires 3. So this cohort of young people that we've been with are now sort of 2021. And it's an ESRC funded project and is involved both large scale cohort surveys. So it's not necessarily the same people year after year, but they're at the same age, you know, whether they're in year 6 or year 8 or year 11, et cetera. And we've had over 40,000 responses to that over the years, alongside with a qualitative part of the research where we've been tracking sort of now we have about 65 out of our original 90 students and their parents. And the concept of enterprising science, Science Capital really emerged out of Aspires, and in part from a conversation that I had with Louise around some of the first survey findings, where she was going, but it should look like this. And I was saying, but the data says something different. And so it was looking like there's something else going on here. And that's sort of some of the research analyses part that sort of fed into this later development. Alongside Aspires, there was another project called Enterprising Science, which was more of a research and development project, looking at understanding some of the factors that influence science engagement, but really looking at kind of developing and testing approaches for engaging students who were from more diverse backgrounds. And while the focus of Enterprising Science in many ways was on what was going on inside science classrooms, a lot of the emphasis on who we were trying to engage with is very pertinent to things like outreach and public engagement as well. So some of the key findings, which are probably familiar to quite a few people if you've heard of Science Capital, from Aspires are around, we hear a lot about, oh, we just have to get kids interested in science / physics / biology / whatever it is. But really, a lack of interest in science isn't the main problem. We see a relative lack of change in terms of who's aspiring to science careers as kids progress through the years. They might change within science, and individual kids might change, but who's aspiring looks quite similar from year to year as they get older. And a lot of this seems to be due to not interest in science, not science not being exciting, but rather structural and systemic issues around things like stratification of science, the double, triple, who's allowed to progress to A level, and the need to specialize so early. And that's probably not a unique problem to science, because it's that way in many subjects, as we know. And then Science Capital was obviously a major thing that emerged out of that project. So kind of in a nutshell, we found that, you know, year after year after year after year, most young people really do like science. They think it's interesting, their parents value it, they are impressed with the work that scientists do, but this isn't translating into aspirations. They don't see it as being for me. And not that we're saying, oh, everyone should want to be a scientist, but that disparity, that gap is really striking. So across our work, we really try to explore why that might be, especially from a sociological perspective, and of equal, if not more relevance, what the implications might be for that, for practice, and what we might do about that. So, that's strange. So, oh yeah, okay, sorry. So Science Capital then really is one thing that influences science participation and who carries on with it, for example, after it's compulsory. But it's also to do with family and structural factors, things like gender, ethnicity, social class, disability, ability, and so forth. The experiences that they have of school science, and particularly the education system as a whole. So it's not just what's happening in an individual classroom, but the overall system, and things like careers education. There are things like how they encounter science outside of the classroom, through the media, through design settings, through community settings, and kind of the popular representations of science that they might encounter. And then, of course, Science Capital is also a part of that. And all of these things, being researchers in education, they're all related, because in social science, that's just the way that's how we roll. So why is science participation an issue? And this is something that's not going to be unfamiliar to most of you. There are concerns around the pipeline, around, are we producing enough? Maybe we are, but what those people look like, what they bring. And from our perspective, we feel that science is both a social good and a personal good. So being engaged with science, pursuing science, that's a good thing for society as a whole, but also it can bring benefits to individuals, whether as citizens engaging with it or as, professionally. So fundamentally for us, these inequalities that we see in science participation are at its heart, it's a social justice issue beyond just concerns around the economy and productivity and so forth. So this is going to be no surprise to anyone, but what we saw year on year is that those who aspire to science, and this isn't just in our own research, they tend to be from more socially advantaged families, they tend to be white or South Asian, male, middle class, have parents who might have STEM qualifications and jobs. And of course, this isn't the case for everyone, of course not, but you do see these larger patterns year after year after year. And part of what's feeding into this then seems to be particularly strong when it comes to physics and exacerbated in that sense. So if you take, for instance, some of the things that are producing these patterns, like this idea that was just prevalent in Aspires and really came out, and in other research as well, as science is for the clever. And so you look at some of these folks and they're all white, 3 out of 4 of them are male, all of them have the reputation of being very, very clever. Not without reason necessarily, but when 80% of people perceive scientists as brainy, what happens for the person who doesn't feel like they're just naturally gifted and clever in that way? There's also association of science with being male, and there are positives like, oh, scientists can make a difference in the world, but to sort of say you have to be really clever and you can change the world and you're male. And so science really seems to be something for the powerful male. It's seen as different and not for me. And again, this is even more the case for physics. So as we go through it, it's worth kind of bearing that in mind when you go out into the world, or when you're developing these activities. What images are you projecting with physics? Does it match up with this? So with that background, I'm going to turn a little bit more to Science Capital, which an introduction for a few, refresher for most. And Science Capital, as I mentioned, was something that was developed in the Aspires project and then really extended in enterprising science. And it's a concept. It's a way of kind of bringing together and encapsulating all the science-related knowledge, attitudes, experiences, and social contexts that an individual might have. And when we did a more, national in the sense of in England, because that's what the budget allowed, survey, we found that about 5%, so quite a small percentage, really fell into this high Science Capital group, and about a quarter had low Science Capital, and then everybody else is kind of in the middle. And part of why this is of interest is we found from both our qualitative and quantitative work that the more Science Capital a student has, the more likely they are to aspire to science and to participate in it, to carry on with it once it's no longer compulsory, as well as having a science identity, to feel like science is something that's for me, and to feel like other people also kind of consider them quite sciencey, and in some ways to be okay with that. So there are kind of 4 main kind of aspects or dimensions of Science Capital, which are science literacy, so what you know, including skills, science-related attitudes and values, how you think about science, out-of-school science behaviors, the kinds of things you do related to science, and then one of the really critical aspects is who you know connected to science, whether it's within your family or just sort of immediate relatively immediate social circles. And so our work on Science Capital was very much, as I mentioned before, informed by sociology and those kinds of perspectives, and a sociologist in particular named Pierre Bourdieu, who initially coined the term cultural capital, which some of you have probably heard of. It's been in the news a fair amount with regard to kind of education and things like that, well, pre-COVID anyway. So I'm not going to go into masses of depth, but there are a couple of concepts that I think are quite important to kind of tell you about how we think about Science Capital and what we're trying to do with it. And so one of the things that's really important is individuals' dispositions, which are they're influenced by all sorts of factors: people's families, their communities, their experiences, their histories. So those dispositions and the resources that they have available to them, it might be people, the connections they have, it might be money, it might be qualifications, it might be stuff, science kits, for example. And then the context that they're in that gets labeled the field, all of those interact, all of those come together to kind of produce these patterns that we see in terms of who engages in science, who participates in it, and who doesn't. So the extent of fit, the extent to which all of these fit together really shapes whether or not students' experience of science or physics or STEM more broadly is kind of like a fish in water. It's comfortable, it's easy, or not. So that's what really influences how they navigate through science and where they go with it, and produces this really strong sense of whether or not science is for me, for people like me, or whether it's alien and other and different and just not. So I've been really interested, and as a group we've been really interested in this idea of playing the game. And if you think about games, well, let's say something like football, for example. They take place on a field, which is kind of like the context, but the important thing is that it also focuses, they have things like rules and officials. And in some fields, an individual's disposition and resources, what they bring, it all works. And that they get on with the rules. And one of the important things about those rules I meant to mention is that they're not set by the players themselves. They're part of the broader structure. So in the field of physics, and thinking about things like researching it or studying it and being in it that way, as opposed to, say, the rule of gravity, it's not really the students who are setting the rules, but these bigger structures, whether it's a university department, whether it's the education system and exam boards, whether it's the Institute of Physics, and maybe some of your roles might be a bit like the officials who kind of enforce the rules about who's allowed in and who's not, or who can engage with it and that sort of thing, or maybe allow them to be bent. And we can come back to that later. But in some fields, what an individual brings and who they are works. They can engage, they can play the game. For others, the resources really don't align with it. Their dispositions don't fit. They can't engage, or what for me is even worse or more troubling is that their efforts to engage are kind of dismissed. Oh, they're not really interested because they're engaging with it not in the right way. The rules say they can't, that's not the right way to engage with this. And so they can't play the game, or we might say they choose not to, but it's not because they can't be bothered. It's because they feel like, I've tried, it's not working. So in terms of Science Capital, what might that offer? And what might that offer to your efforts to engage with possibly a wider range of audiences around physics? And so from our perspective, we've kind of been working with it in a few different ways. One is treating it as a framework for kind of understanding why some people engage with physics and others don't. It's a reflection tool to think about your own practice and what you're doing. And then there's also kind of a pedagogical framework, which we call the Science Capital approach, that may help to build Science Capital, to start with people where they are and build from there. So in terms of kind of understanding, it kind of links back to what we were saying before. It gives us the opportunity and helps us maybe understand why some people, but not others, are able to kind of get on in particular fields in these contexts with their rules and regulations and officials and so forth. And it also offers this explanation as to why it is that some people feel sciencey and comfortable in science-relating settings and others don't, or physics settings and others don't. And really kind of starts to draw attention to the setting and the context and the field and what it is we're doing, as opposed to it being about, well, that's their problem that they're not sciencey, they just can't be asked, or they're not interested. And I'm sure none of you have that attitude, but it is something we've encountered. And so that leads on to thinking of it as a reflection tool and thinking about what's valued by the field, what kinds of attitudes, what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of experiences, understandings, ways of being, thinking, resources. What is it that's like, oh, that's interesting, that's something you bring, and what's not, what's more kind of dismissed. And it can really kind of encourage us to consider various aspects or dimensions of science capital that we might be able to focus on in what we do, and not just being about making this particular concept area or this particular content really exciting, which of course it is, and not that that's not important. So we had kind of the 4 dimensions that I was or 4 areas that we were talking about earlier, and we've kind of broken that down further on the basis of a lot of survey work that we've done over the years. And it's kind of a scary slide, so I'm just going to go through it, but I think this is all going to be available afterwards. So yeah, Ollie's nodding. So it's, some of the basic things are scientific literacy, knowledge, understanding, skills. And that's something that is generally part and parcel of what we're doing, but it's some of the other things that we're really kind of trying to encourage more. So dispositions and preferences related to science, and that's really to do with seeing it as relevant to their everyday life and taking some of that responsibility on ourselves. How can we adapt what we're doing so that it is relevant, rather than telling people, you need to see that this is relevant because I say so. Knowledge about the transferability of science and science qualifications, where they might take you in the labor market beyond just, scientist, science teacher, and so forth. It's the kinds of things people do, whether it's consumption of science-related media, participation in out-of-school learning contexts. It's things like family, parental, scientific knowledge and qualifications, but also knowing people in a meaningful way, people that you might have conversations with among your wider family, your sort of slightly wider social network, not your 600 friends on Facebook, but maybe the I don't know, 40, 50 closer family and friends and that sort of thing. And then talking to people, just how much of it is a part of your everyday life. And so we found that all of these together contributed to the extent to which someone was able to engage with science. It helps kind of explain, it helps us understand the extent to which they might identify with science and get on with it. So that's all very well and good. But what can we do? How might we put some of this into practice? How might we use some of these ideas to engage with more diverse individuals or audiences? And I've made mention of some things to start thinking about, but I want to get into this idea of a pedagogical framework. It's kind of a teaching framework, but sometimes that implies like a science classroom. So we kind of broadened it out by using the word pedagogical. And after about 2 years, we worked with about 43 secondary science teachers over actually 3 or 4 years to develop this teaching approach that we called the Science Capital Teaching Approach. And then we further developed it and trialed it over the course of 2 years. And at its heart, it's really concerned with social justice, as all of our work is. And I've put up this image because sort of equality, there are different approaches to it and the way people think about it. There's equality, everyone gets the same. There's equity, people get what they need to see over the fence. And social justice is really about trying to take down that fence. So it's not about changing physics. It's not about changing, that there's a baseball game on, in this case, maybe it'd be cricket, I don't know, that people want to watch. This image came from the US, but rather thinking about the barriers and the structures that are in place that privilege some people and disadvantage others and prevent some from being able to access physics, to maybe, they're really interested in it, but they can't access it. And are there things we can do to push on that fence? And in physics, and I think this is where there's a really interesting role for things like public engagement, it really has a lot to do with this image of it as something as being for the very clever. Physics is an elite club for the very clever, nearly always male. So I've heard people say things like, oh, we're welcoming, anyone can join our club. But the message is really, anyone can join our elite club if they're clever enough. And those messages can be a bit of offense. So this is sort of, we had this kind of graphic that sort of summarizes the approach, and I'm going to go through it in a bit more detail in just a minute. But as we developed it and then trialed it over a couple of years, there was a fair amount of data collection over that process of observations, of student discussion groups, student and teacher interviews, surveys. So when I talk about it and why we feel like this might have some legs, is that it's not just we developed it and we think it's great, but we do have some actual data behind it. And so perhaps not surprisingly, kind of that foundational element is broadening what counts. And importantly, it's what counts in the classroom, what counts in the activity, what counts in the setting, not what counts as science, which can be particularly contentious with, well, physics, biology, almost anything. But it's that, you know, it kind of goes with that thing that I've been saying, that some people really struggle to engage with science. It feels so alien, and really trying to encourage you to change the field rather than the individual. Think about what you're doing. It's not that deficit model people are in need of fixing, but really, are there ways, can you open things up so that individuals can be recognized for what it is that they bring, can be recognized as being scientific, that there are other ways of kind of participating other than something very narrow and regimented necessarily, and recognizing that people might have skills, might have experiences that are useful for engaging in science, that might help them contribute to an activity, even if it's not the physics lesson, for example, and trying to kind of challenge some of the stereotypes and dominant ideas about who does science, which again is tricky in physics because it's a lot of white middle-class males who have traditionally done physics. And so to kind of say, oh, no, that's not the case, now it's completely different, you know, there is a tension there, but can you challenge around who can do it, and try to at least open up and open up where studying this might lead in the future. So how do you actually go about that? And again, those are these three pillars. And one is personalize and localize. And it's going beyond just contextualizing it to really try to link it to the particular audience, to particular young people's everyday lives. And this is really, really tricky when it comes to things like public engagement and outreach. But at least, you know, I want to encourage you to kind of try to think about, are there ways things you can do to kind of get to know your audiences a little bit more? And are there things that are probably perhaps common across some people that they might share that you could kind of connect to? And so it's going to look different each time, but to try to start thinking about how you might go about that, so that you can link to participants' own lives and their own experience. And one technique there is what we call elicit value link. And it's kind of a way to help young people feel valued and connected. And so it's sort of eliciting experiences and skills and home knowledge, trying to find out, can you ask a couple of questions to find some of this out in relation to what it is you're doing or featuring or talking about. And then valuing it, not just saying, yep, next, but, oh, that's interesting, tell me more, or rephrasing it for the audience, that sort of thing. And then it's up to you, not them, but to you, to link that to your science, rather than sort of saying, oh, well, they'll need to make that link. And again, it's really challenging in some of the one-off things that we do, but it's worth thinking about how you might kind of build that over time. And then there's trying to build the science capital dimensions. And it's really about kind of focusing on more than just the science literacy and understanding of how science is everywhere and the transferability of science, or somehow to encourage kids to talk about science maybe at home after whatever experience you provide. So in our research, there were a range of positive outcomes. Student science capital increased. There was more interest in studying science at A level. Students felt science in school was more related to their lives. But this was a year-long classroom intervention, you know, the science teachers implementing the approach over a year. So what about things like public engagement and outreach? And this approach has, you know, been quite popular, including in things like public engagement and formal science learning settings. But there are a lot of different ways that this gets kind of interpreted and talked about. And we've quite often encountered sort of this deficit model coming up again. Before it was pour in content, now it's we're going to pour in science capital. We're just going to give them more science capital. They're going to come in and they're going to see our show or see our, you know, hear our talk, and then they'll leave with higher science capital. And it's more complicated than that. But, you know, I'm a social scientist, I would say that, wouldn't I? And it's sort of, but some of those things, you know, just by being aware of it can help us hopefully kind of move away from that. That's reflection piece, and trying to move away from seeing family and people's backgrounds as, you know, as a problem, but rather as a resource, something that you can maybe link to. And there are certainly efforts for doing this. One is the Science Capital in Practice project that's being led by ASDC, which I think some of you would be familiar with, the Association of Science and Discovery Centers here in the UK. And they're working with, or have been until sort of March, science centers to help kind of increase diversity and inclusion by applying an approach that's really informed by Science Capital. And Louise Archer, who's the lead on all this work, has been working quite closely with that project. And there's also Explore Your Universe 4, which is also an ASDC project, but it's funded by STFC as part of their Wonder Initiative. And it involves really these science centers collaborating with community partners, and involves multiple engagements over time with really small numbers. So they're really kind of rethinking this Explore Your Universe from, it's got to be big and we've engaged with 200,000 school kids or whatever, to we've engaged with 3 families. And it's really getting to know those families, getting to know those partners, really drawing on the strengths they have and linking that, you know, back into the science. And well, it was very exciting until it all shut down, you know, in March. Another example that I just want to talk about when we're thinking about how we might implement it, and this is from what's called the Yes STEM program, Youth and Equity in STEM, I think, which is also run by, coming out of my group, but I'm not directly involved. But they were looking at, it was this small locally run zoo, which I know is not physics, but bear with me for a second. It was a week-long program, and they had a mix of sessions, and this is where it starts to get interesting. You know, science, maths, focusing on habitat and adaptation, but there were some activities around not just environmental awareness, but sort of designing things for the zoo, like a bird box or a bug hotel that would stay there. There were posters that they could get quite artsy and creative with, but also the content needed to be, you know, relevant to the zoo. And then this got left there as part of the zoo. So the young people enjoyed the program. They had increases in knowledge and skills. They had increases in confidence and agency and feeling like, ooh, I can do something that makes a difference, and became more involved over a week. And so it's the kind of positive things that we might like to see. And one of the things that's interesting is that, what was it they were doing? So they had these very inclusive practices. Everyone gets a go. It wasn't just one person, but everyone got to have a try at something. And everyone got to sort of express themselves in particular ways that really made it very local to them. And they really importantly broadened what counts, that sticky thing about as doing STEM, being recognized in STEM, because it was more hands-on. It was very different from their classrooms of, you know, sitting there and doing the book work, or even the you know, step-by-step recipe of a you know, lab or whatever. And it really mixed arts and science. So it said that, you know, these two things don't have to be distinct. You can bring some of your creative side into science. And we might say, oh, well, of course that's the case, but that's not as clear to young people. They can't necessarily picture how that works. And then it was really about kind of empowerment and helping them reflect on the actions that they could take, which may or may not be as relevant, you know, in physics, but just there were things to think about. And they had these really caring relationships with the educators, and who were very caring and respectful towards the young people. And again, it helps that you have time to develop relationships, but is there some of that you might be able to incorporate into your practice? So that's been a bit of a sprint, and some of those practices might kind of overlap with, you know, in our kind of different instantiations of some of the Science Capital teaching approach. So with that sprint, we do have time for a few questions, and then we were going to move into more of a discussion, I think is the plan. Yes, Ollie?
Yes, that's correct. Jen, thank you so much. I think Science Capital is so powerful because it not only kind of illustrates and, you know, shines a spotlight on where some of these barriers to engagement come from, but also provides a useful practical framework for how we might reflect on our practice and tweak our engagement and bring things forward. So yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions. I can see a few people have got their hands raised as well.
Yeah, can I stop screen sharing for now so I can see people?
If you do that, that'd be great.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I can always re-screen share. Oh no, that was the wrong button. There. Okay, I can always put that up if there's a particular slide that people have a question.
Thank you. So I'll do a mix. We received quite a few good questions as well through the chat. So I'll go first to the people with their hands up. So Chris, I'm just unmuting you now. Over to you.
Hiya. Thanks for a great talk. It's really so interesting and useful to see all of that set up. I think it's, as you noted, the term Science Capital's escaped into the public engagement community, and now it means a lot of things to a lot of people. Mainly they all think it's important,
The horse was 2 miles down the road by the time Louise Archer looked up and started trying to bolt the barn door.
Yeah. I wanted to ask in particular, I think it was in Pillar 1 where you said that it was important to make things relevant, and I think that's one of the least well understood things, because especially from a physics point of view, I feel like where people go with that word is straight to, like, if it's not about something that's in your kitchen cupboard, then it's not relevant. So I wonder if you could unpack that word for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is very, very tricky when it comes to physics. I think one of the things about, to kind of give a different example slightly, but it's this sort of, by personalizing and localizing, we heard a lot about, oh yes, but I do that already, because when we do a concept, then I say, oh, and this topic relates to these 3 jobs, but it might not be 3 jobs that the kids are interested in. So it's sort of finding out what jobs they are interested in, and then when you have a topic that you can link to, whatever Joey's interested in, oh, Joey's really interested in this field, so making that link to what they all already are interested in. And I think that would extend beyond just careers. So it's sort of where the challenge lies for you is in thinking about sort of I suppose what kinds of things you can link to that people might, that might involve people's experiences. So, I mean, in the absence of a specific topic, it can be tricky. And I remember there was some topic in chemistry that the teachers were like, we can't do it. We just can't do it. And then but students were so on for the ride already that for that one topic, it wasn't the case. But I think, could it be finding out if something was to do with astronomy of what have you seen, who can tell me if they've, what constellations they've seen? Have you seen this one? Have you seen that one? And just sort of creating a space to say, hey, your personal experiences have a place here. I'm not going to just stand here and preach content at you. I'm going to listen to your experiences. And I think as you get to know the kinds of things that people are talking about, and what is important to them, then thinking hard about, can I relate that, a really interesting direction that a lot of this has gone in has been, what are community issues that people might, be able to kind of co-opt your knowledge to help them, or your topic to help them solve. So maybe it's not something that's in their kitchen cabinet, but rather something that is a concern to them. Is the thing that you're focusing on something that a bit more knowledge about that might help them address that? I'm afraid I don't know what topic you are, but you see, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think there's I started to think about relevance as being personal as well. Like, you could remember that, think of a time when you're stuck on something at school. Well, that's very much, lots of us have that experience in our physics. So I think there's some creativity, but that's really helpful.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example, actually, if you're talking about kind of the process of science and saying, oh gosh, who's been stuck on something? Let me tell you a story about when I was stuck, and kind of going from there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jen. I'll take Becky. I'll take your question, and I'll move over to some of the questions that we had from the chat. So I'll just unmute you there, Becky. Bear with me.
Oh, thanks. I have 2 questions, so I'll leave my hand raised, but then we'll go to the chat and come back. Thanks for a good talk. My first question is about so the Aspires project that sort of did a lot of the sort of background study to come up with this idea of science capital was very much focused, you said, on 10 to 18-year-olds. And you said that there was no change in their aspirations to become a scientist in that time. I remember there was an IOP, so Institute of Physics, and Ogden Trust, like joint project research. I'm not sure what the correct term for it was, but looking at when children specifically come up with this idea that either science is a male, like a topic for boys and not for girls. And they found that was about sort of 6 or 7 years old. It was like year 2. It was all of a sudden like, oh, the Kinects is for the boys and the dolls is for the girls, and that somehow already delineated that. So I wonder if maybe this idea of science capital, pushing it into the primary area, is what necessarily needs to happen in order to get. And I wondered if you'd done any sort of research on that already. And you're probably nodding as if like, yes.
I'm interesting that Louise did not prompt you with that. Yes, indeed. So there are two things here. One is that as we, you know, with the benefit of fabulous 2020 hindsight and everything else, as we were, you know, getting into to the whole project and the kids were in year 6, it was this sort of, we really should be looking at this earlier. But, you know, we were kind of doing this longitudinal thing, so it wasn't going to go down real well to say, actually scrap that, we're going to, you know, but and it's been quite useful. But yes, definitely it starts early. Definitely these things, it's not like a on-off switch, but these, you know, ideas of who does science, what science is, start forming really early, and as well as loads of other gender stereotypes, and then it just gets more and more entrenched and relates to their identity and how they see themselves and the aspirations that they develop. But we also have a primary, the primary science project that is working with the Primary Science Teaching Trust. So I've only been sort of involved with it in kind of a more advisory, you know, or almost, you know, aspires emeritus kind of, or emerita kind of position. But yeah, so they are working, it's been super interesting to try to see to what extent you can measure it, to see what does it look like among primary school kids. You know, that's really one of the key questions to me. And then they're trying to sort of develop the approaches with primary, and it's a very different thing from secondary in the sense that the secondary teachers are quite comfortable with the science, but they don't know their students as well, whereas the primary teachers actually do know their students as well, and they're often less comfortable with the science. So how it pans out, I think it's gosh, how long has it been running? About, I want to say 6 or 8 months so far, so it's still in quite early days. But yes, that is a key focus for us at the moment. And definitely where we want to be going. We didn't get quite as much funding as we would have really needed to do it, but we're hoping that the preliminary work that we've got funded, then we can get more funding to really scale it up and develop it further.
Great, thank you, Becky. Thank you, Jen. I can see Kat's got her hand up, and I know, Kat, you raised quite a few questions through the chat. So I'll unmute you, give you a chance to ask some questions.
Hi, so sorry about that. I thought we were doing it mostly by the chat rather than asking directly. Hi, I think the first time I heard about the concept of science capital, I think I'm right in thinking they were making the comparison with the idea of cultural capital.
Yeah.
The concept of cultural capital came first,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the idea of science capital came from that. And I was just quite interested in knowing whether, do you know if there's any data comparing the distribution of both? So if you have good cultural capital, do you also tend to have more science capital? And related to this question, whether you know about any similar studies done in other countries. So is the distribution that we're seeing very specific either to England or to Western countries, and therefore it has a different distribution elsewhere?
Yeah. So the science capital versus cultural capital, yay, one of my favorite questions. Yeah, you know, I've written a paper. But yeah, so we have been from the get-go, so from the first Aspire study, drawing on other research that had, you know, measures of cultural capital. So we've been doing that as well. And science capital and cultural capital absolutely are related completely. However, what we were able to see statistically, as well as, you know, in our qualitative data, and then we kind of go and test it out with the survey, is that it's not the same, if that makes sense. Like it's not, you can have kids with relatively higher cultural capital, or science capital, and not so much cultural capital. And what you see a fair amount is kids with higher levels of cultural capital who don't necessarily have as much science capital. So you may have a family that's really just not interested in science, but they have the resources, they have this, that, and the other thing, that they can kind of support their kid's interest in science. So that kid does then have more of the necessary supports, even though the family isn't as engaged in science and it doesn't, you know, feature with them. Yeah, so that's, and I think that's part of the usefulness of it, is that, you know, because sometimes we hear people say things like, oh, well, it's just the same, it's just social class, that's all it is. And I think there were two things that are interesting. One is that looking at it both with our own data as well as with some Wellcome Trust Monitor data, is that it's not completely the same thing. It's related, yes, but not completely the same thing. And also, so, you know, so that's nice from a research standpoint, but also that if you're thinking about how it might inform your practice or the kinds of things you do, and you're talking about science engagement, then it provides, I think, you know, in the way we've developed it, some more guidelines that are sort of distinct to science, perhaps. I mean, they could very well translate over into art or anything else necessarily, but we were just focusing on science, and so that's where we found it to be quite helpful. Does that answer your question, I think? Oh, I can't hear you. Ollie, can we unmute her?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, no, that answers my question. I don't know if you, sorry, I don't know if you were going to answer this separately. Do you have an idea whether similar studies have been done in other countries as well?
Oh, right. Yes. No, we don't. Actually, I don't think they have. We know that some work has been done, you know, trying to measure science capital in other countries. We know that, you know, with cultural capital, it's particularly tricky once you sort of start moving out of Western Europe, because what's valued is kind of determined by the field. So it's a very sociological way of saying that, you know, if you go to a different country with, you know, if we take well, pounds may not be such a good example these days, but let's just say you turn up in Russia with your pounds, you can't directly use those in the store. They, you know, you need to translate it into a different form of currency that has value. So certain skills, certain attitudes, certain things, you know, are valued differently in different cultures. So you can't really necessarily translate it directly, but there'll be something that is comparable to, you know, there'll be some sort of cultural capital in other countries. There'll be science capital as well. It just might not look the same in different cultures, which is part of the challenge, but what makes it interesting. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kat, for those questions. Thanks, Jen, as well. We had time now to move over and focus a bit more discursively and to reflect on our own practice, but looking at the number of questions that we've got in, and actually I think that almost warrants a separate session in itself, where we try to unpick our practice and how we might apply science capital. So what I propose is we can stick to the questions. If anyone thinks that's a terrible idea, wave wildly or unmute yourself and scream. Okay, all right. Well, look, let's carry on with the questions then. I want to move to quite a big picture question that Martin's asked. He just wanted to know, can you talk a little bit about how you came up with an overarching concept like science capital and its underlying dimensions, and then how you turn that into some sort of measurement?
Okay. Oh, and I was just going to add real quick that, you know, we can carry on with the Q&A. That's great. And if, Ollie, you want to, you and I can lead to organize just a discussion, an online discussion at a later point, then, you know, I'm up for that.
Thank you.
So anyway, so right. So how we came up with the concept of science capital in the first place, that really had to do with that initial conversation, or partly to do with that initial conversation that Louise and I had. And it was partly about the quant data not saying what she thought it would, and then seeing these patterns in our qualitative data that were exactly, that kind of mapped onto someone's, to the question about our cultural capital and science capital, the same thing of saying, okay, there are these patterns that we can't explain, you know, that are sort of usual suspects, gender, ethnicity, social class, they relate to, but they didn't, there was something else going on. And one of the phrases that I use is there seem to be these young people who we were interviewing, you know, when they were like 10 years old, which makes it interesting from the primary perspective, who seemed to be just swimming in science. There was something that it was just very comfortable for them. It was very, it just all fit and all this, you know, and that was sort of the way I was describing it. And then Louise, with her hardcore sociology, love of Bourdieu kind of thing, that fit, she kind of took that and you know, and she saw it as well, and started running with it from this theoretical perspective and seeing, can this kind of, does this give us a tool, does this give her a tool for talking about and explaining what we were seeing? So that's sort of where the initial conceptualizations were coming from. And as we started talking about it, the horse starts, you know, bumping against that barn door, trying to get it open or something. So yeah, so that was sort of the initial constructs. And then because we had the Aspire survey, and then with Enterprising Science, that gave us the chance to do another one. We thought, we literally sat down and said, can we measure this? Can we get some, because in part because the funder was really interested in that as well. And so we drew on the Aspire survey, what was coming out of that, drew on our theorization around it to sort of say what would it look like, and it developed like a lot of surveys do, with something big, and then and then kind of statistically rationalizing that, and then doing things where we knew qualitatively that these families at this point, the conceptualization or the theorization had moved on enough to say, okay, these families where they had more of a science, what they call habitus, these kind of ways of being, and who had higher science capital, those kids were more likely to maintain their aspirations over time. And so we knew that there was something that kids with higher science capital had, stronger science aspirations and science identities. So then we were able to see statistically, again, what kinds of things specifically were most likely to be related to it. I mean, all of it was to some extent, but finding our key things, the things that were most closely related, and all of this we kept checking because we had these annual surveys that we were doing with, anywhere from, we usually had anywhere from sort of 1,200 up to about 4,000 responses. So we had good volume to kind of play with statistically to work with that. And and so that was, and then we kept kind of validating it by repeating it, tweaking it, trying different, looking at the different weights, how it was related, and making decisions related to that. So that's kind of how that all came to be. And it was always kind of a bit spooky how, after kind of 5 years of doing this, and it was like, okay, maybe that, kind of being nervous going, will the analysis show that we've been wrong this time? Oh no, it looks just like the other 4 years of it. So, so that was sort of how it came about. I think that answers that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks very much. And Martin, thank you for that question as well. Okay, so Paolo had an interesting question. Maybe you have recommendations on this. How do you reconcile the dissonance of trying to make physics available to everyone, but at the same time belonging to an elite institution that is very selective and only wants the smartest for education or research?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's the crux of the problem, isn't it? That you've got, I mean, I almost feel like, well, there are two things that I think that institutions that, we only want the brightest and the best. Well, of course you do. But I think who qualifies as the brightest and the best? We're not saying, oh, somebody who failed physics at GCSE, well, we're gonna, but think stars are cool to look at, we're gonna, bring them in kicking and screaming. But it's rather kind of saying, thinking very critically, if, I don't know if any of you are in a position to do so, but the department's thinking very critically about, well, what do our students coming in really need to be able to know? What do they really need, is somebody who gets a B in GCSE physics and a B in A-level physics, will they actually, is actually that amount of understanding sufficient if they've got the enthusiasm and that sort of thing, and sort of recognizing that maybe we're not going to have, well, actually, no, you would have, is that actually sufficient to, and we'll take it from here. I mean, you hear a lot about, oh, well, you get to university and then the first thing they tell you is that everything you learned beforehand, just ignore that and we're going to start over. So it's really just a stratifying thing. And in fact, somebody with a B would be perfectly capable since you're throwing it all out anyway. And to say that as a field, it's more important to have these different perspectives that might come from different experiences and that sort of thing than not. I mean, we know somebody from Aspires who was hugely enthusiastic about physics, loved it, but got a B in her GCSE, and it was like, you're not doing A-level. So is that strictly necessary? Are there ways that university courses can be, if the ideal at the end is to produce these genius PhD students who go on to do just astonishing work in physics, is a potential path to that, doing Bs and just receiving really good, having really good educational experiences at university that then allows them to draw on this creative, slightly sideways perspective into it. I don't have the answer to that, but it's something to think about.
I think that's the thing. Driving institutional change is huge, and across the group we've all got varying degrees, I suppose, of influence and ability to help bring that about. But I suppose it's just about being advocates in the conversations that we have internally, isn't it? And just helping to chip away and move things along.
Yeah.
But Paolo, thank you for that question. That does strike to the heart of what we're trying to achieve and discuss. Okay, so moving on to another question. Let me see, sorry. So one around definitions, I suppose. Catherine asked, in the study, children largely say that they don't aspire to be a scientist, but what does scientist mean in this context? And what do the children understand it to mean?
Yes, love this question. Okay, so there are two things here. First is that, you know, and it was my favorite graph actually of the project, and Louise just didn't like it as much, so it didn't get on, you know, a lot of people's slides. But when you said sort of aspire to be scientists, that was really low. Then aspire to have a job that uses science, that was a bit higher. Or something like aspire to work in science was a bit higher, job that uses science a bit higher, carry on studying a bit higher. So it's sort of like, as you get closer and closer to this being a scientist, you know, with all that that contains, which is why these sort of images that people have of scientists are so important, you know, people get more reluctance. It's sort of, I'm committing my whole self to being a certain type of person, and that's pretty big. Now, the other issue is people say, well, what do they mean? What do they understand by science? And that's where that whole stereotypical image of it comes in. And we've got the, you know, if I had 5p for every time, you know, I heard this critique across the Aspires project, I'd be retired, and retired well. But of saying, well, they don't really understand all the jobs that, you know, what being a scientist is really like, what it involves, the variety, the this, the that, the other thing. And that's exactly true. But the issue is that but the perceptions that they have that come from the media, that come from their experiences, and whether in the classroom or outside the classroom or anywhere else, that's what drives the choices that they make. So, you know, if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of your 8-year-old self, if somebody said, no, I know what you really want to be. You really want to be X, and you've never heard of it. And it's like, what? You'd ignore them. And so, yeah, and so it just doesn't work that way. So yeah, so they do have, you know, science, when we were talking to kids in year 6 and lower than that, I mean, there's all sorts of research and all over the place. Loads of people have looked at this generally as in part and parcel of something else, because the findings have been so similar for however many years. You know, it's explosions, it's, you know, experiments, it's things like that. And the more they're exposed to a range of scientists, the more that opens up. But, you know, it's important to bear in mind that, you know, that's always a bit of an uphill battle. So and that's why it's so important to continuously be conscious of what images you're projecting and what images, both as a field and as an individual.
Okay, thank you, Jen. I'm conscious that I promised Becky another question, and she's waiting patiently with her hand up. I'm going to set you both a challenge. If you can make the question quick, Becky, and if you can make the answer within a minute or so, Jen, that will help to include time at the end just to share other resources. So over to you two.
Oh, Ollie, you're going to hate me then, because my question was about your idea of playing the game. And you had like the people who play the game and the people who are like, oh, the rules don't apply, therefore I'm not going to play the game. And my question was how you think the rise of sort of like internet science conspiracy theorists, like flat earthers and electric universe people, fit into those categories, and whether there's any hope in rescuing them, because they probably do have very high science capital and yet have somehow ended up in this weird sort of almost like odyssey of confirmation bias.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, in some senses, I almost can't, although it's probably, well, I don't know actually, because I was going to say like that there was an interesting finding out of the Monitor that some people who had higher science capital, you know, and science capital connections were more likely to do sort of not the holistic therapy. What am I thinking about? The stuff that Prince Charles was into with the drops, the weird something or other. Anyway, you know, alternative medicine. Yeah, some sort of alternative medicine in particular. But yeah, they were more likely to do that, and it was all came down to they had the finances to do it. So why not give it a go? Or at least that's what we think. So in terms of the complete alternative theories, I mean, I'd say almost in some senses, they're choosing to play their complete own game entirely, I suppose, and that their perception of, you know, and it probably isn't helped by scientists saying, you know, being dismissive. Oh, that's not science. you know, and if you're just told, oh, your view, your opinion isn't valid, then, and completely discounting it, then they're going to disengage and carry on in their, you know, internet wormholes and that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, so I mean, I'd never thought about that before. That's really, really interesting. Because yeah, I'd heard a lot about sort of curiosity, and there's some really interesting work around people who are curious, you know, see themselves as curious people being more open to their opinions being changed. But
just to flag in the chat, Martin's reference that Netflix Flat Earth documentary touches on a lot of these elements quite nicely. So some extra.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I just wondered if it was like specific, like science, like a science capital could be used here to sort of help with this. But
I think in terms of, not in terms of, oh, let's try to build their science capital, but rather, regardless of whether they do or they don't, to sort of, and you hear it in medicine, you hear it in loads of things, of sort of trying to listen and understand their concerns, and can you connect to that and say, you know, and it's sort of, well, that's interesting, how does that sync up with this or that or the other, you know, something like that. Yeah. Wow, super interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That is a huge last question there. Thank you.
Sorry,
It's good. I'm glad there's some good, real probing questions. We've hit time. I'm conscious that everyone else is very busy and needs to get away. So we will wrap it up there. Jen, I know you're happy to share the slides. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'll also, because the last slide in your presentation has a series of links for further information, which is really helpful. We will endeavour then to set up another session as well, where we explore our own practice and use science capital as a lens and also as a framework for kind of bringing that on and developing it. So details for that will come. I can see I've already got my first response in for the survey. In the chat, I've put a quick Survey Monkey link. It's 2 minutes, I promise, but it will just help me understand and us understand how we can best support ourselves as a group of public engagement professionals and researchers and practitioners in this field. So please take a moment to share that with us. But all that remains for me to say is, Jen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been really fun. When Ollie first approached me, I thought, ooh, that sounds like fun, and it was.
Oh, good. I'm glad you've enjoyed it. We're a friendly bunch, and I can see rounds of applause coming up. That's the thing we miss, a live round of applause.
Ollie, I'm not sure if my email address is, I know it's not on the slides, but yeah, feel free to share that if people don't have it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and when you share the slides, either everybody please be gentle, because they're like notes to myself, but they have a lot of you know, transitions, things in there, or just share a PDF. I don't mind either way.
We can do some editing. We can do that.
You know, you can get insight into it.
Brilliant. But also thank you to all of you. Thank you for your contributions, your questions. It's been brilliant. And Catherine as well, thank you as well for kind of coordinating things behind the scenes as well. So I hope you've all enjoyed it. I hope you all have a good day, and I look forward to seeing you soon at the next public engagement seminar. Thank you very much.
Great.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you later.
See you.